The American Friends Service Committee of Arizona works to reduce the prison population and improve conditions for incarcerated people in Arizona using research and documentation, advocacy, and policy reform. Established in 1981 as one of Arizona's only prisoner advocacy organizations, AFSC Arizona confronts mass incarceration and prison industrial complex through reforming harsh sentencing laws, halting prison expansion and privatization, ending solitary confinement, and advocating for prisoners' rights. I introduce to you, and I'm very glad to welcome Caroline Isaacs, our speaker.
So I'm very pleased to come and speak with you about one of those many issues that Evelyn spoke about. We work entirely on criminal justice issues in this AFSC office, but nationally and internationally, the organization works on a variety of social justice issues, including immigration reform, economic justice, and peace and demilitarization. So, go to our big, giant, convoluted website and you can learn more about that stuff. I'm so pleased that there's interest in this kind of obscure and, as I said, depressing topic, and I'm just glad to see so many of you here on a Sunday morning. I get a lot of people asking me, well, aren't you just preaching to the choir? When you go and talk with folks who are already interested in social justice issues and you tell them what they essentially already know about what's wrong in the world and what they ought to do. And my response is, yes, but the choir needs to sing louder. So that is my message to you today, and you should know you never ask an organizer to come and just talk to you, right? We don't just talk to you, we're going to ask you to do something at the end, so be prepared for that. Because things need to be done, and things can be done by people like you, and so I'll talk more about that later. There are many facts about prison privatization that I could tell you, statistics and figures and cost numbers and data, and all of that is collected in our various materials, and I'm happy to share those with you later. But I think, given that I'm sermonizing today, I wanted to address the really core, essential moral and ethical issues involved in this practice. These are things that we are sharing with most faith communities, with most societies, and as Americans. And I think those tend to get overlooked in many of these debates about, well, is it cheaper, is it not cheaper, are the prisons working, are they not working? There are some fundamental ethical principles that I think we need to get back to. And my position is that essentially for-profit mass incarceration violates some of those most basic and fundamental ethical and moral principles that our society is founded on, and most others. So I'm going to talk about 4 of those specifically and give you some very depressing examples about specifics around privatization of incarceration and how it relates to each of those. The first is the fundamental principle of forgiveness and redemption, right? This is a core Christian value, it's a core value of our democracy, right? Folks are supposed to be welcomed back into the beloved community even when they have wronged, even when they have made mistakes. However, the concept of justice, forgiveness, and redemption are all but erased from our current criminal justice system. Your felony record can follow you. It can never be erased, right? And that sets up barriers for legalized discrimination against folks with a record in housing, employment, education, and various areas. And the net of the criminal justice system is being cast ever wider, right, to bring in more kinds of folks and keep them there longer. So even after your time is served, you can be subject to some form of supervision, be it probation, parole, community corrections. Sex offenders can be civilly committed for the rest of their lives to a secure mental institution after they have served their sentence, for the rest of their lives. All of this presents a very tempting market for the for-profit prison corporations. They are moving now into these other aspects of the criminal justice system in order to preserve and expand their profits. The second largest private prison company, GEO Group, has a subsidiary called GEO Care. GeoCare. This has begun pursuing contracts or even buying up facilities like mental hospitals and those civil commitment centers. This and other private corporations are attempting to hijack the well-intentioned efforts around sentencing reform, the people who are trying to reduce prison populations, get people out of prison, and put in alternative programs. Well, now GeoCare is going to sell you an alternative program, right? So they're essentially creating prisons under another name. Treatment prisons, I swear to God, I've heard that term. We're going to open up treatment prison, halfway houses, day reporting centers. Even more insidious is an emerging practice in the South of predatory for-profit probation, which basically preys on poor people and people of color who are brought in on relatively minor infractions but can't pay the associated fine. So you get a traffic accident, you get a ticket for something, and you just don't have $200 that day. These folks must pay a monthly sum to this private company that their county contracts with, not just to pay off the fine, but to pay the company for supervising them so that the county doesn't have to. This practically guarantees that this person is going to fall ever deeper into debt. And some of these companies actually employ their own bounty hunters to come after folks, to ring them in. These corporations have figured out that the longer the state has control over a person, the more opportunities they have to make money. So just as we saw them lobbying for laws to criminalize more types of behavior in order to fill prisons and detention centers, we now see them working to co-opt well-meaning efforts to reduce prison populations. So instead of getting people out of prison, they're simply shuffling them off to some other part of the system. Right? Now I need water. I'm the yellow one, I can't drink everyone's wine. So the second fundamental principle I want to speak to is that of welcoming the stranger, which we read about on the back of the program today. This is one of the covenants of this very denomination. And we all know that the good book tells us to love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. In today's heated debate over immigration, not only have many people forgotten the exodus from Egypt, they've forgotten their own more recent history, like the discrimination faced by their own immigrant ancestors in this country. Rampant poverty in tenements in New York City, Italian immigrants abused and sometimes killed in textile factories, signs saying no Irish. But just as private prison corporations have learned to criminalize drug addiction, alcoholism, mental illness, and other issues, they have benefited from and in turn promoted and lobbied for criminalization of migration. In the past, unauthorized immigrants were processed through the civil immigration system, right, and dealt with as an administrative matter and essentially repatriated to their country of origin. But in 2005, a program called Operation Streamline mandated that most immigrants caught crossing the border be referred for criminal prosecution in the federal court system, part of a larger trend of criminalizing economic refugees. And the result is an astonishing change in our nation's criminal justice priorities. Federal spending on immigration enforcement now surpasses all other federal law enforcement activities combined. That's the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Secret Service, the U.S. Marshals, and the Bureau of Tobacco, Alcohol, and Firearms. Latinos, as a result, now make up more than 50% of all those sentenced to federal prison, despite the fact that they are 16% of the U.S. population. The federal government has spent an estimated $5.5 billion incarcerating undocumented immigrants in the criminal justice system for unauthorized entry and unauthorized re-entry. These are crimes, right? Unauthorized entry is crossing the border. Unauthorized re-entry is crossing the border again. And that's above and beyond the $2 billion per year that it's traditionally spent on the civil detention system. And of course, capitalizing all of this is the for-profit prison industry, primarily GEO Group and Corrections Corporation of America. 43% of all detainees were held in privately operated facilities in 2012. In 2011, contracts with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, accounted for 20 and 14% of revenue for CCA and GEO Group, respectively. And as you may very well know, CCA operates 3 facilities that have contracts to house immigrants here in the state of Arizona. The current immigration reform bill being debated in Congress would expand Operation Streamline in the Tucson sector. And in reality, anything labeled immigration enforcement basically means profits for private prison companies. Because the more border patrol you have, the more apprehensions you have. The more apprehensions you have, the more prosecutions, and that means more incarceration. The third principle I want to speak to is that of love. And our reading from Dr. King this morning, I think, speaks to this incredibly eloquently. The diseased roots of criminalization are fear, racism, and greed, period. And this political mechanism through which that operates is a system of social control, right? That which those in power do not understand, like mental illness, that of which they disapprove, like drug addiction, and that which they fear, like young black men in hoodies, must be suppressed, must be controlled through the system. For-profit incarceration companies actively exploit this social control dynamic by lobbying for policies that criminalize various groups and advocating for ever harsher penalties for lesser offenses. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Every social issue we have, every conflict between people is something that has to be made illegal. You guys heard about the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC? Folks are familiar with that? Anybody not familiar, so I can give you like a 20-second, okay. So ALEC is essentially an organization that has 2 kinds of members, legislators from various states and corporations. These are the members of ALEC. And what ALEC does is it puts on these very fancy soirees a couple times a year at some resort, like in Scottsdale last year. And all these legislators come from all over the country and get wined and dined by the lobbyists for these various corporations. Okay? And then together they create model legislation that each of these legislators then goes back to their home state and introduces in their state house. Does that make sense? Right? Yeah. So, ALEC for a long time had a public safety task force, and it was chaired by Corrections Corporation of America. And this was in the 1990s. So what was the big deal in the 1990s? What were we hearing about? Like crime was a huge deal. Crack, right? Crack epidemic. Crack this, crack that. And also there was this big deal about the well, meth was later. The meth thing is modeled after the crack thing, I think. But the other thing was this big total hype around juvenile super predators. You guys remember this term? Mm-hmm. There's this coming wave of juveniles, and they're all like dangerous and violent little budding criminals. And so essentially, the media and politicians were playing upon and reinforcing Middle America's fear of black youth in inner cities, essentially, young people in general. During that time, ALEC's model legislation included truth in sentencing. You guys know what truth in sentencing is? It got rid of parole. We used to have this thing called parole where, you were given a sentence of 5 to 10 years. And after 5, you get to go to the parole board and say, I've taken these classes, I've done well, I haven't gotten in trouble, and you may get released early. Now, this did away with that completely. So in Arizona, we don't have parole anymore unless you were sentenced before this law. And it replaced it with a mandate that prisoners serve, in this case, in the state of Arizona, 85% of their sentence. You could be good, bad, or indifferent. You could be a total Boy Scout in there, and you're still going to serve 85% of your sentence. And that's across the board. Violent, nonviolent crimes, everybody. Like most other states did truth in sentencing, but they applied it mostly to serious and violent crimes, and they applied it at 65%. But Arizona goes all the way. So that was one of the ALEC model legislations. The other is mandatory minimums. Everybody heard of mandatory minimums? Yeah. Completely removes the discretion of a judge and says if you have this much drug, you get this much time. That's the most obvious example, right? And 3 strikes and you're out laws, which of course were also a big deal in the news back then. And these policies have been directly linked to the soaring growth of prison populations in the US and the disproportionate incarceration of people of color. More recently, questions were raised about the for-profit detention industry's involvement in SB 1070. You guys remember that flap? Which, if enacted, would have sent many more immigrants to detention centers run by CCA here in Arizona. These corporations have been aggressively lobbying Congress regarding comprehensive immigration reform. Yes, please expand Operation Streamline. Yes, please put more Border Patrol on the border so that we can get more butts in our beds. When we begin to think of our brothers and sisters as criminals, we erase their worth. We erase their humanity. They are less than and therefore do not deserve the same rights as us, right? And this distracts us from the underlying racism, xenophobia, or fear that is at the heart of the issue. It lets us off the hook by saying, oh, it's not about race, they broke the law, right? This creates a situation within which people can be torn from their families and communities and abused with impunity under the guise of punishment for their infractions. And the rest of us are not supposed to care. The final fundamental ethical issue I want to speak to is that of economic justice. I think the bottom line in many cases is that the profit motive is directly at odds with the purpose of corrections, which is to correct behavior and therefore reduce future crime, right? Unfortunately, future crime is something that these companies depend on for the financial health of their business. These companies, to borrow a phrase, cannot serve two masters, right? They cannot serve the public interest and their shareholders' interest at the same time because they are diametrically opposed. And consistently, we see that they are choosing to serve the latter. They choose to serve their shareholders first. The first priority of a for-profit corporation is to make a profit. But the business of corrections is inherently expensive, at least if you're doing it right. It costs money to feed and house people decently. It takes money to give them medical and mental health care, to treat the underlying cause of their behavior, and to teach them a better way. But these are the places where private prisons cut corners, choosing instead to just warehouse people, because for them, every person in a bunk is a dollar figure, right? There is a perverse incentive not to rehabilitate, not to treat, and not to help. Because it is in the corporation's financial interest to keep prisoners coming back. And if they get sick or even die, the worst the company will generally face is a series of fines or maybe lawsuit settlements. Even if a state cancels a contract, there's always some other state where the leaders believe in this myth that you can have mass incarceration on the cheap. And so they just go down the road and open another. The bottom line is that for-profit incarceration commodifies human beings. Every soul in a bunk represents a dollar figure to these corporations. Private prisons are human trafficking. It is a shameful, obscene practice that flies in the face not only of correctional principles, but of the most fundamental values we share as people of faith, as Americans, and as members of the human community. So now that I have delivered the world's least uplifting sermon, I would like you to know that there is something that you can do about this. Many things, actually. And I'd like to read a quote for you from Donna Redwing. Anybody know who Donna Redwing is? She is a big-time Unitarian Universalist, and up until recently was the executive director of Grassroots Leadership, which is a national organization that works against for-profit incarceration. She invited me to be on a panel at the last national gathering of UUs in Phoenix. So we did a panel on for-profit immigration detention. And she said this: the first two principles of Unitarian Universalism address the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. In this country, we are engaged in the buying and selling of women, children, and men. As a Unitarian Universalist, I challenge you to engage. If we say nothing, if we do nothing, we are complicit in this obscene commerce. So as you probably know, the Unitarian Universalist Statement of Conscience on Criminal Justice and Prison Reform from 2005 commits each congregation to take action on these and other issues related to criminal justice reform. And I want to commend you on having actually done this, right? You are already engaging in prison ministry. We heard the voices and the observations of some of those actual folks today in our readings. And you've suffered through my sermon today, which qualifies under both the learn about the local jail and prison system and the network and collaborate with existing community outreach programs requirements of that statement. So you've already taken many more positive actions than a lot of groups that are concerned about things, but have a hard time taking that next step of doing something about it. So now I challenge you to do more. Faith communities are a very powerful voice in public discourse as well as in politics. Many denominations have formal statements like yours does. And in several recent fights against private prison proposals around the country, coalitions of faith groups have sent letters, published editorials, held press conferences, and other events to register their opposition. AFSC here in Arizona has been working to form a coalition of faith groups opposed to for-profit incarceration. In 2012, 19 different congregations and religious organizations signed a letter to Governor Brewer asking her to halt plans for 2,000 more private prison beds here in Arizona. This coalition is in its infancy, and it could be more proactive and have greater impact if there were leadership and energy from within. I encourage you to consider working with AFSC and other faith groups as part of this coalition to provide a stronger voice for people of faith opposed to for-profit incarceration in Arizona. And so I would be happy to provide you with more information. There are some basic materials in the room with the coffee about that coalition and about other faith groups' stances on the issue. And we are really wanting to work in community and in coalition with people of faith in the state of Arizona to expand the capacity of that coalition. So please do come and talk with me and take a look at that stuff, because there are so many things that you can all do about this and have a voice with integrity and with credibility in Arizona. Because like I'm just the wacky, Quaker from that Bleeding Heart group. So thank you again for spending your morning reflecting on this issue. Your light, your thoughtful consideration, and your hard work can and will be instrumental in challenging this sickening and destructive practice. So say we all.